Welcome, welcome to all my favorite ghosts and ghouls. Welcome to Halloween Cozy Horror with me, Dr. Plague. Get yourself a place by the fire and find something warm to drink as you settle in for 5 terrifying holiday classics written by yours truly. Let's get you started off right with an oldie but a goodie. A story involving everyone's favorite winter boogin. Let's hear a little bit more about the 8 dancing scarecrows. Detective Lance pulled up in front of the farmhouse, marveling at the way the corn rattled in the fields. The corn was wrong, he could tell that right away, and Lance could honestly say that he had never seen corn look that way. The husks were brown, the corn inside turning black as it rotted on the stalk. He had been impressed by the amount of corn surrounding the farmhouse, acres of skeletal stalks that made the farmhouse feel like an island in a dead corn sea. The police cars out front looked out of place in the dirt yard, and as he mounted the stairs, one of the rural cops came out to meet him. Lance was on loan from the nearby precinct, and the clock was ticking. He had about 36 hours to find anything that would lead them to 5 missing people. They needed his help in discovering what might have happened to the Murphy clan. "Bring me up to speed," he said, nodding at the man as he came onto the porch. He looked like any other state trooper, his coat trimmed in fur, his hat leaning into something more cowboy than law enforcement. He tugged a pack of smokes out of his pocket and lit one, the smoke curling up against the rafters of the porch as he assessed the big city detective they had called to help. Whatever he saw, he seemed unimpressed, and his smile was more than a little mocking. "Well, well, by all means, sir, let me fill you in on what us bumpkins have managed to turn up." He flipped open a spiral notebook and started flipping through the crumpled pages. Lance didn't much care for his tone, but he held his tongue as the trooper flipped through the notes. The county Mounties had been working the case for about a week, and had no idea what had become of the small farm family. The report said that the Murphys, 2 adults and 3 children, had suddenly vanished from their large farm. They'd also disappeared right around harvest time, leaving their cash crop in the ground. This made their sudden vanishing act all the more confusing, and Lance was eager to get his teeth in this one. Let's see. On October 23rd, their closest neighbor noticed the crops in the field had changed. They said it appeared that frost had killed all their corn overnight and just left it to rot. This was at odds since it had never gotten below 50 degrees on any given night recently. They came to check on the family and noticed that they were gone. Last time anyone could remember seeing them was on the 12th when they came into town to buy pumpkins for the kids. The children were out of school for the harvest, and they were getting ready to bring in the corn when they suddenly vanished. That's all we know, and that's why we called you in. I think the sheriff hopes a fresh set of eyes will prove useful. Have you found anything inside? No blood or bodies, if that's what you mean. We've found nothing to make us consider foul play, and no signs of robbery either. There's no reason at all that they should have left their house, and their vehicles are still there too. So, unless they walked out on foot with a kid under 3 and 2 under 18, we have to assume that they were abducted for some reason. Lance nodded, thinking over what they knew and adding it to the small amount that he assumed. With kids present, there was a pretty good chance that it had been a kidnapping. This was the Midwest, and it wasn't uncommon to have a whole family get picked up by traffickers, or worse. The location of the farm would mean that it would make it easy for them to disappear without notice. All the corn would mean that their crime scene would go unnoticed, even if they tried to run. They would likely never find the Murphys, not alive anyway, but Lance had to try. He was one of the department's best detectives, and he had a lot to live up to. "Show me the house. Let's see what I can find." "Alright, but we've pretty much gone over this whole place with a fine-tooth comb. I'm not sure there's much else to find." After an hour and a half of searching the scene, Lance feared he might have been right. The farmhouse had 3 rooms. One was clearly a bedroom. The other one was a big room for the kids. The third was a big open room containing a kitchen, a living room, and a sitting room. The home was pristine, recently clean and freshly swept, and everything looked far too orderly for a kidnapping scene. The dishes were done. There were clothes laid out for the next day. There was no sign of a struggle or a fight, and Lance couldn't figure out how they had been taken so neatly. He was searching the kids' room, looking for anything, when he came across the journal. It was nothing, just a salt and pepper mead notebook left on the floor as if it were a tent for natives. It was the most out-of-place thing in the house, and it stood out to Lance for some reason. He couldn't have said why, but his eyes tracked back to that book no matter where he was in the room. As he left, he scooped it up and took it with him as he went back to the living room. Lance opened to the page it had been left on as he walked up the hall, reading what appeared to be an entry for October 10th. Daddy's mad. Someone keeps stealing our scarecrows. They just disappear out of the field, and Daddy's getting pretty upset about it. He's certain that Dale is stealing them, but Dale swears it isn't him. Scarecrows are pretty heavy, so I'm not sure how he could steal them by himself. The field looks so empty without them. It's just corn as far as the eye can see. Sometimes I stand on the porch and just watch it wave in the breeze, hearing it rustle as the stalks chuckle together. It used to be comforting, but it's a little creepy lately. The rustling makes me think of a monster moving in the corn, and I've spent less time in the corn by myself. Hopefully, whoever's stealing our scarecrows will get caught. That way Daddy won't be so mad all the time. It was signed, Register Murphy. Register Murphy had been the middle child, Lance remembered, as he flipped to the next page. He was supposed to be about 8, and by his writing, Lance could believe it. It read like a typical child's journal, but Lance found himself intrigued all the same. If the kid had seen something, maybe he'd written about it in the journal. Something like that could help him narrow down the culprit or even a motive. Lance furrowed his brow and turned to the next page. There was indeed a visitor, but it wasn't the one that Lance had expected. October 11th. There was a surprise in the field this morning. Daddy was standing on the porch this morning when we came out to work, and he was scratching his head as he looked into the east field. Standing on a brand new post, its body turning rapidly, was a brand new scarecrow. It was dressed in a dark blue suit, a tall top hat on its round head, and the head was a small orange pumpkin. I thought maybe he was turning in the breeze, but then I realized that there wasn't any wind. The corn was still, and the usual rattle was gone. The scarecrow just kind of moved on its own. It danced something smooth and graceful. His arms were boneless, his legs kicking freely, and as the post wiggled around, he continued to dance and sway. I thought Daddy would be mad, but he seemed pretty happy about the scarecrow. He thinks it's funny, a dancing scarecrow, and he says it'll bring luck to our crops. His mother told him a story about a dancing scarecrow that brought rain and grew the corn 30 feet high. As he told it to us, I could see that it meant a lot to him, and he thought it was a big honor to have a dancing scarecrow in one of our fields. We were farming in the field he was in that day, and I couldn't help but watch him as he danced and swayed. Daddy seemed real happy, smiling every time he looked at the thing, but I was a little creeped out by it. I was working close to it, and I couldn't help but notice when it turned its head to look at me. The greasy face was far too lifelike, and it seemed to linger on me every time it got close. We brought in the corn, but I dreamed about that dancing scarecrow last night. It was dancing right in front of me, its mouth screaming as it twisted. Its dance became more and more violent, straw flying as it flailed around. Its screams started sounding like laughter, and as it fixed its eyes on me, it started to whisper, "He comes! He comes! He comes!" Who is this person he's talking about? What'll happen when he comes? Register Murphy. A dancing scarecrow? What the hell was that? Lance wondered. Had the kidnappers been dressed as scarecrows or something? There was no way that one person had kidnapped 5 people and spirited them away with no one noticing. Lance turned the page and read the next entry, seeing a pattern as the young boy laid out the days before his disappearance. The more he read, the less childish it sounded. The longer he read, the more it sounded like Register Murphy was detailing the worst days of his life. October 12th. There are 2 of them now. The new one is dressed in a yellow suit with a matching hat, and despite looking brand new, it looks like it was colored with pee-pee. They stand side by side in the fields, kicking their legs and swinging their arms, looking like they're trapped in a windstorm. Daddy clapped when he saw them, saying that this was exactly what he wanted. The story said that more scarecrows would show up, and I almost shook when he said it. More scarecrows? How many more? There were 2 kicking and dancing, smiling their greasy grins as they wiggled around. I was working alone in the east field today, picking the fields as far from the scarecrows as I could, when I heard them whispering. They were talking, just like they had in my dream, whispering about coming or whoever he was. I heard the corn rustle as it came over in the row next to me, and suddenly there they were, both of them dancing, spinning in the air like typhoons, and I could hear them whispering and screaming all around me. I covered my ears as they swirled, and when Dale found me crying, they were both gone. As I lay in bed that night, I heard them rustling amongst the corn plants, their bodies lashing wildly against the corn stalks, and the sound they made my skin crawl. October 13th. Daddy's gotten weird. When I came out to work today, he was talking to the scarecrows. There are 3 of them now, one of them in a blue suit, one in a yellow suit, and the newest one in a gray suit with a matching top hat. They were all side by side in the east field, dancing and swaying as they held Daddy with their black eyes. They seemed to be gently swaying, not the usual violent dancing they do, and they almost seemed to be listening to him. Listening or talking. He didn't help us today. We all went to work in the fields, picking corn and packing produce, but Daddy stayed with the scarecrows. He looked strange out in the field in his sleeveless t-shirt and his sleep pants, and when Mama went to go talk to him, he told her to go back inside. We were all on the porch carving pumpkins when she came back. Even Thomas was hacking away at his pumpkin's face with a butter knife, and Mama looked scared. She said that Daddy just wasn't feeling well, and when all the pumpkins were lit, he was still standing out there in the dark, talking with those scarecrows. I heard them out there dancing again last night, but I never heard Daddy come back inside. Register Murphy. Lance flipped back and read the last bit again. His dad, Marcus Murphy, was acting strangely. That could explain why his family had suddenly just up and disappeared. Maybe whoever these scarecrows were, they had help from the father. It was too soon to tell, but it was a working theory. That would explain why the vehicles that the family owned were still here. If the people running those scarecrows had their own vehicles, they could have disappeared easily without a trace. He kept reading, wanting more information, hoping for some other clue as to what had happened. October 14th. Daddy was still in the field, and so was a new scarecrow. He was in a green suit, and it looked like it was woven out of grass. All their heads are pumpkins, but unlike ours, they don't look squashy or attract flies. They just sit up there and smile and stare and look real creepy. Mama's worried about Daddy. All she does is sit at the window and watch him while he's in the field. He just stays in the field for some reason, listening to the scarecrows and talking with them. He moved around the cornfield sometimes, not picking or boxing, but just walking around aimlessly. Dale and I have been doing most of the work, but sometimes I can see the scarecrows following me. I felt like they might get me when it was just the 2 of them, but now there are 4, and it feels like they might trap me out there. They grin at me from out of the corn, watching me work, and when I try to tell Dale about it, he just tells me to stop being a spaz. Last night they were all over the field, and I had to put my head under the pillow to stop from hearing them. They sound scary, and their whispers are even louder now. They say he's coming, and that he's gonna get us. I don't know who he is, but I don't want him to get me. If he's as scary as the scarecrows are, I don't want him anywhere near the house. October 15th. Daddy's gone, but there's a new scarecrow out there now. This one's dressed in orange, and it matches the pumpkin he wears as a head. Mama told us to stay inside and went to go look for Daddy in the field. She couldn't find him out there and told us all to stay inside today. It started to drizzle a little, and while Thomas watched TV and Dale read, I sat by the window and watched the scarecrows. There are 5 of them now, and each of them are dancing just like the others. The rain doesn't hurt their spirits at all. They sit out in the rain and dance and sway on their posts, rustling the corn and sending streams of water flying off when they crash against them. It's weird, I wouldn't swear to it, but they look closer to the house somehow. Like when Daddy stood out there talking to them, they seemed farther from the house. Now I can see the rain as it slides off their faces. They're not on the porch, but it feels like they're close enough to throw a rock through the window if they wanted to. Thomas doesn't like them much. He came to sit with me, and he said they were scary. He says they came and looked in his window at night, and he always hides and cries until they go away. I never checked to see if they came to my window. Maybe tonight I'll stay up a little and wait to see. This was looking more and more like a case of psychosis. The father had a break from reality and had done something to his family. Whatever this dancing scarecrow nonsense was didn't matter. It was pretty clear that something was going on with Marcus Murphy. Something tickled at the back of his mind as he read, though, and Lance couldn't help but think about something a friend had been telling him about. The scarecrows, the constant use of he, reminded him of Stephen's case. He shook it off, though, not wanting to muddy the waters with a different case. He called over one of the officers and asked if they could see if the family vehicles were all accounted for. He wanted them to check into places on the property where bodies could be hidden, like a well or an old drainage line or something. He suspected that the bodies had been easy for Marcus to move after they were dead, and wanted to know if there was anywhere on the property that they had found blood. "Nowhere, sir. There's not even a slaughterhouse. Marcus grew corn for the ethanol plant. Corn's pretty much his only crop. A lot of farmers out here grow mostly corn, and Marcus used every acre he had for his corn crop." Lance nodded. "What about a basement? Somewhere he might have taken them to kill them?" "No basement. Barn's clean. House is clean. The men are searching the field for anything that might be suspicious." Lance let the officer get back to it, noticing the deputy he had talked to when he came in, eyeballing him as he spoke with a large man in mirrored sunglasses. He returned to reading, seeing the possible sheriff nodding his head in his direction. They likely wanted to know what he knew, but he wasn't ready to tell them just yet. He didn't have a full picture, but he suspected it might be fuller than theirs. October 16th. Someone smashed our pumpkins last night. I can see them on the porch through the windows. Their guts have been scattered all over the porch, and their shells are lying across the yard. Daddy's still missing, and Mama won't let us leave the house. We found her on the porch this morning, and when Dale helped her inside, she sounded like something had scared her half to death. Dale didn't want Thomas and I to hear, but Mama said we needed to hear about it nonetheless. As she drank the coffee that Dale had made for her, she told us about how Daddy had called her out to the field, but it hadn't been Daddy. She had been woken up by the sound of him calling her name through the window. She'd seen someone standing there, their silhouette tall and broad like his had been. He had called her by name, and then moved towards the field as she went out in her nightshirt. The fields had been dark, the corn lit only by the silvery moon overhead, and Mama had followed the sound of crunchy husks underfoot. She could see him as she walked, and had hurried to catch up with him, but then the corn on either side had started rustling. Something was to her left, her right, behind her, and Mama felt hemmed in. She stopped following Daddy, and that was likely all that had saved her life. It seemed he had been hiding the sickle somewhere out of sight, and when he turned to slash her, she was farther back than he thought. Mama ran, bumping into one of the scarecrows as she careened into the field. Daddy was hot on her heels, and she ran blindly as she tried to lose him. The scarecrows popped up randomly as the rows of corn swung by on ghostly rails. Her legs burned and her face was wind-burnt as the stalks battered against her. She ran for her life, running on pure adrenaline. She didn't know how long she had run. She didn't know how far, and as the sun peeked up over the horizon, she collapsed on the porch in a heap as she prepared to be killed. When she opened her eyes again, it was morning, and Dale was helping her inside. There are 6 scarecrows now, and the newest one has a white suit and hat. They're all out there dancing now, swirling in the rain and rustling the corn plants. I think I can see Daddy out there if I look closely. He's still carrying the sickle, and there's something over his head, though I can't tell what it is. I'm scared. I don't understand what's going on, but I know we won't be going back into the field anytime soon. October 17th. Daddy is stalking the house from the fields. The new scarecrow, number 7, has a light pink suit. Most people would say it's supposed to be cute, but not me. It looks like old blood. Mama's standing at the window, watching Daddy as he peeks at us from the corn. His head is covered by a pumpkin now too, but it's not the same as the scarecrow's. His head is already starting to wilt, the pumpkin looking sad as he looks out through the eye holes. Thomas is crying, and Dale looks mad. He keeps pacing around, holding the old hatchet he used when we went camping. He keeps snarling out at Daddy like he's gonna do something, and Mama seems worried that he will. It's getting dark now. I hope we make it till tomorrow. If you know something, Detective, it would be best if you shared it. Lance looked up from his notebook and into the reflective lenses of the sheriff. He was immensely fat. his belly pressed against his duty belt as he loomed over Detective Lance. He was grinning, but it was clear that his intentions were less than friendly. He was used to cowing his inferiors into doing what he wanted, but he might have overestimated his pull this time. Lance was not the sort to be cowed so easily. "If I should learn anything that I think you need to know, Sheriff Leibrook, I'll be sure to let you know." Leibrook grinned, and Lance could see every one of his tobacco-stained teeth. "That ain't quite how things work around here, hoss. We called you in on this one. That means I'm here to help you. That doesn't mean I work for you. Now, if you want me to be efficient at my job, let me work." Leibrook put his hands up and backed away, still smiling, but clearly not liking being rebuffed. Sure, you're the big-time detective after all." Lance looked back to the journal and continued reading, the cops now giving him a wide berth as they moved around him. October 18th. Dale left. He and Mama argued about it for hours, the two of them shouting in the back like they thought Thomas and I couldn't hear. Thomas has been crying in the living room, but Mama never came back out. Dale disappeared into the corn, the 8th scarecrow seeming to turn to the side to admit him. This one's wearing a black suit, making him look like a reaper. When he turned back to look at the house, I could clearly see the scowl that was sketched into his face, making it look different from the rest. It's dark now. I can see my breath as it steams out of my mouth. Thomas is shivering, and Mama still hasn't come out of the back room. I can see the ice swirling on the glass. The corn outside is rattling differently tonight. I can hear the ice breaking off as it hits the ground. The scarecrows are very close now. I can see them in the dark, the moon casting their shadows across our home. The shadows slide greasily into the farmhouse, and I moved Thomas away from them and put him to bed on the couch instead. We're both wrapped in one of Mama's old Afghans, but it's so cold. It's almost hard to write. My fingers are so numb, and I don't think I'll be able to write much longer. Someone's coming out of the corn, someone on a horse. Daddy's with him, Dale too, and he's wearing armor like a knight. He has deer antlers on his head, and there's an axe over his shoulder. I can see his eyes. They're red like coals, and they're burning under his helmet. The closer he gets, the more frozen the windows get. I can't see anything now. It's too icy, but I can hear the clip-clop of his horse's hooves. I know I should be scared, but the cold is sinking in, and I'm getting tired. Thomas has stopped shivering, and I think I'm going to close my eyes for a few minutes. Lance felt his breath hitch as he read the last entry. The handwriting here was cramped, almost illegible, the scribbles of a child who was learning to write. He stood up suddenly, taking the notebook with him as he went for the door. The big-bellied sheriff tried to step in his path, but Lance sidestepped him, never stopping. The sheriff cawed angrily behind him, but Lance was out the door and across the dooryard before anyone could stop him. They would never find the family, no more than they would find any of the others who had disappeared under similar circumstances. As he drove away, he was already on the phone with the only person who might be able to use this information. "Steve, it's Lance. I've got something you need to see. I think I might have more information about your Green Man case." It's always my favorite time of year when I get to write a little about the Green Man and his holiday exploits. I think of all the characters I've created, he is one of my favorites. Probably second only to the Warden of Stragview. What a creepy creature he is. Moving right along, though, we have another tale involving everyone's favorite armored fella. Let's hear a story about how Jeffrey hates jack-o'-lanterns. Jeffrey hated jack-o'-lanterns. This was a problem, since his hometown was known as the jack-o'-lantern capital of the United States. Every year, the town was host to thousands, if not millions, of carved horrors. It had become a point of pride for their Midwestern town. The town had been full of pumpkins since its founding back in the 1800s, and the town was filled with glowing, grinning gourds from September till April. The public commons had 3 large greenhouses that grew pumpkins during the cold months, and no citizen had to pay for one of those pumpkins. Jeffrey was pretty sure it came out of their taxes, along with road works and the police force. Jeffrey had grown up carving, eating, and hating pumpkins with a red-hot fury. As a child, the glowing gourds had frightened him. His parents were never sure why, but he was terrified of them. Until he was 7, Jeffrey had refused to even carve one, and he remembered getting into some trouble several times for pushing them off the porch. It never stopped a new one from appearing where the old one had been, but it always came with a stern talking to about wasting pumpkins. Pumpkins were a hot commodity in the town, and were not something to be squandered. By the time he was 17, his fear had turned into a deep hatred. A hatred that had brought him to this moment. Jeffrey was sitting on the commons with his friends when he got an idea. Hey, what if we pulled a prank on Halloween? Like, a big one. Chris looked up, cigarette smoke curling over his face, while Chris leaned over his handlebars and grinned stupidly at Jeffrey. What kind of prank? Chris asked, cigarette hanging from his mouth like a modern-day cowboy. Chris was your typical greasy teenage troublemaker. He was decked out in a leather jacket, ripped jeans, black boots, and a constant need to smoke the cigarettes he usually lifted from his dad. Chris likely considered himself some kind of badass, and Jeffrey had seen him make good on enough of the idle threats he made to agree with him. Despite this, Chris was the most stable of Jeffrey's friends, and he made quite the contrast to the grinning idiot leaning on his handlebars. Something big, something they'll never forget, Jeffrey said, grinning hugely. Jeffrey was watching them unload a wagon of pumpkins from the greenhouse as they loitered on the commons. Jeffrey wanted nothing so much as to watch them all become compost. Like, maybe some soap in the fountain again? Kevin suggested. Kevin was the polar opposite of Chris. If Chris looked like a greaser, Kevin looked like a generic Chad. Blonde hair, blue eyes, tap-out t-shirt, gold chains, wind pants, and lots of pictures on his phone of his well-crafted physique. Kevin and Chris had been Jeffrey's friends for a long time, but the truth was that he mostly just used them as muscle. He wanted them in case things went south, and something like this had the potential to go very wrong very quickly. No, Kevin, something a little bigger this time. I'm thinking about smashing some pumpkins on Halloween night. Kevin grinned, but Chris raised a pierced eyebrow at him. Are you kidding? You know how anal this town is about those damn pumpkins. If we go around people's houses and smash up their jack-o'-lanterns. No, I'm not just talking about the ones on people's houses. I want to smash all the pumpkins. The ones at the houses, the ones at the shops, and the displays on the commons, too. The two of them looked at him in stunned silence. By morning, I don't want a single jack-o'-lantern in the whole town unpulped. Kevin grinned like a shot fox, nodding his head and raising his hand for a high five. Jeffrey obliged him, holding his hand up to Chris next. Chris didn't say anything, though. His lips were slowly creeping into a distinctive evil grin as he thought about the implications, and he slapped his own palm against Jeffrey's at long last. Chris was smart, probably smarter than anyone Jeffrey knew, but he loved a good trick as much as anyone. The idea of all the townspeople seeing their pumpkins smashed, their town pride destroyed, made him feel like the Grinch at the end of the movie, sans the change of heart, of course. We'll be legends, more than legends. We'll be infamous, Chris said as he pulled his hand into a raised fist. Jeffrey laughed. Boys, I guarantee that the day after Halloween will go down in town history when we're done. As they sat on the commons and started to flesh out their plans, Jeffrey had no idea how right he was. They stood in Jeffrey's garage later that day and made plans. Halloween was 5 days away, and they had to make sure that they could commit their prank and get away with it unscathed. Being arrested for a stunt like this would only elevate their street cred, but Jeffrey was honestly a little worried about how the town would take what they were getting ready to do. As the three rode through town to get to Jeffrey's house, they passed through the downtown and saw the shops littered with pumpkins. The plaque that commemorated when the world's largest pumpkin had come through town with the fair one year showed resplendently on the front lawn of the town hall. The display table of pumpkins outside Jack-O-Lantern's museum made the table sag under their orange mass. Jeffrey thought once again how vital the stupid things were to the town. They would get in real trouble for this, so the first order of business would be masks. They'll need to be full face too, Chris put in when Jeffrey brought it up. I don't want them seeing our hair, our noses, and identifying us somehow. Kevin laughed. Easy. My bro and I are heading to Seaver Friday night. You guys slide me some cash for masks, and I'll bring back some quality stuff. Jeffrey looked at Chris, and he looked back at him. This was a big ask from Kevin, a guy who still got lost on his way to school sometimes. Kevin's role in the gang was muscle, that was obvious, and trusting him with something like this was a stretch. If he got distracted when he and his bro got to Seaver, they could be out of money and have no masks for this caper. Chris was right when he said full face mask would be a must, and the shops in town wouldn't have what they were looking for. Kevin must have noticed the look, because he got a little frustrated. Oh, come on, guys, I can do this. Do you want good masks or not? Chris shrugged at Jeffrey, who sighed as he took out his wallet and handed Kevin a 20. Kevin looked at Chris, opening and closing his hand as he crumpled Jeffrey's 20 in his grip. Chris dropped his motorcycle boots off the table and rolled his eyes, pulling out a 20 of his own and adding it to the pile. Kevin reached into his wind pants and took out a 20 of his own, adding it to the pile before pushing the whole wad into his pocket. They were taking a big chance on Kevin, and both made sure he damn well knew it. The next 5 days were agony for Jeffrey. He couldn't tell anyone what they were planning to do. That would ruin the prank, but they still had to make sure they had an alibi. Providence threw them a bone on that one, because their friend Mark was having a Halloween party that night. One RSVP later, and they made the party part of their plans. People would see them, they would remember that they had been there, and Jeffrey and his friends could sneak out at 9:30 and be back home before any of the booze-soaked brains had time to miss them. It was the perfect plan, and promised to give the boys maximum deniability if questioned. Even so, Jeffrey didn't sleep well that week. He was plagued with dreams that he would stagger awake from and fall back into as soon as he closed his eyes. Jeffrey saw himself smashing jack-o'-lantern after jack-o'-lantern, a deep fog surrounding everything as he moved from gourd to gourd. All the while, something watched him from that haze. Jeffrey couldn't see it, but it was big. Its red eyes seemed pleased at what he was doing. Now and again, Jeffrey would raise his bat and salute to the mysterious figure, and it would rear back and cackle like a demon. These dreams terrified him, but Jeffrey always woke up feeling elated at the regard of this creature. The three seemed to plan constantly that week. They would use their bikes as transportation. Jeffrey figured their bikes would cut around with less notice than a car, and they would be faster than on foot. He figured they would have about an hour and a half tops to pull this off before the devastation was noticed, and speed would be critical to the operation. Kevin had some baseball bats in the shed that they planned to use, and the three of them began to map their route. As long as Kevin got the masks, they'd be home free. He winked at them Friday afternoon as his brother came to pick him up from school. Don't forget, Jeffrey reminded him. I've got this, guys, Kevin scoffed, hopping into the Jeep as the two peeled out for Seaver. Chris and Jeffrey parted ways then, hoping against hope that they would have the last pieces of the puzzle soon. Chris sent him a text later that night saying, I still haven't heard from Kevin. Jeffrey sighed as he buried his face against the pillow. Kevin had better not mess this up. Chris came over the following day and found Jeffrey in the garage. He was oiling the chain on his bike when Chris pulled up. He was preparing for tonight, and Chris looked put out. Jeffrey could guess the source of his anger. Kevin had been radio silent since yesterday at school. Not a text, not a call, not anything. He forgot, and you know it, Chris said. We don't know that, Jeffrey said, trying to remain positive. Though brilliant, Chris could be volatile and was prone to moodiness sometimes. Jeffrey didn't want him bailing out at the last minute. He won't return my text, and his phone goes straight to voicemail. If he and his brother spent the night in Seaver, we could be screwed. Jeffrey started to speak, but at that moment, a familiar Jeep pulled up in his driveway. Kevin leaned in to say something to his brother, before taking a brown paper sack from the back seat as the Jeep drove off and Kevin approached the pair. He was all smiles, not reading the room at all, and when Chris walked towards him, he spread his arms out as he prepared to wrap him in one of his annoying bro hugs. When Chris socked him in the gut instead, Kevin's grin faded as he groaned and fell to his knees. Jeffrey pulled him back, but Kevin took it in strides as Jeffrey tried to pull the greaser away from him. What was that for? Kevin gasped, not really hurt, but definitely startled. That is for bugging out and going radio silent for the last 24 hours. I dropped my phone in a puddle about 5 minutes after we got there. I didn't realize you two were so worried about me. Chris balled up his fists, straining against Jeffrey as he tried to hit Kevin again. Jeffrey pushed the greaser into a nearby recliner, kicking up a cloud of dust as he tried to settle Chris. "No worries, as long as you got the masks," Jeffrey said, still not holding out hope for this scatterbrained musclehead. Kevin's grin threatened to cut his head in half. "Oh, I got the masks. I think you'll find them very fitting, too." Jeffrey took the bag from Kevin, feeling the thick rubber masks inside the plain grocery bag. He reached in and pulled out a ghoulish orange mask that made him grin as wide as Kevin. The plastic thing looked like a demented jack-o'-lantern, its gaping black mouth cut into a frightening double row of teeth. Its black eyes were angled with malice, and Jeffrey could see a few plastic roaches crawling up the nostrils as he took it in. It was perfect. Jeffrey couldn't believe that Kevin had picked this out. It would be fitting to attack the town's established idols with their very likeness adorning their faces. He tossed a second mask to Chris, and the greaser goggled like a fool as he took in the ghoulish thing. Jeffrey could feel a lot of the anxiety melting away, and when he raised his hand this time, it was to give Kevin a hearty high five. "Kev, these are perfect." "You act like I would bring you anything less," Kevin said, with no small amount of swagger. Jeffrey pulled the mask on, feeling the plastic set on his face like a second skin. "Tonight, we're gonna make history." As the sun began to set and the trick-or-treaters started to gather on the sidewalk, the three set off on their bikes. They had their bats and their masks stored in their backpack, along with the required 6-pack of beer to get into the party. They had dressed darkly in black pants and hoodies, and they were prepared to ride the streets like phantoms after dark. They arrived at Mark's party about 7, the festivities already in full swing. It was a typical high school underage drinking party. Lots of people making out in the living room, a collective of smoke clouds around the back and the front porch, people dancing around to loud music, and a kitchen that was 5 parts wet bar and 5 parts buffet. Mark's parents were out of town. They always seemed to be out of town, and Mark's house was typically the place where parties happened. The three stood around and sipped warm beer, keeping an eye on their watches, their nerves tuned up to 1,000,000,000. They didn't want to be there too long, just long enough to get noticed. They would say hi to some people from school, play a few rounds of beer pong, and at 9:45, they would slip out and take their bikes off quietly. They had been going over their individual routes for days. Chris would take 5th through 6th Street, Kevin would take 7th through 10th Street, and Jeffrey would take 11th through 15th Street. There were roughly 5 to 10 houses per street, and everyone would meet up downtown when they were done. If someone got done early, they would start smashing pumpkins downtown and wait for the others. If the cops came, they would run. The person discovered would lead them away so the others could keep smashing, and then meet back up when they lost them. They would not assume the vandals were organized. They would think they were holiday pranksters out for fun, and if they grabbed one of them, the other two could finish the night's work before anyone was the wiser. When Jeffrey's watch jangled to let them know it was 9:45, the three of them snuck out the back and rode off into the night. They split off at 10 o'clock. The front porch is dark, save for the glow of the jacks, and the streets were mostly free of trick-or-treaters. Jeffrey slipped on his mask as he came to 11th Street, grinning beneath it as he pulled his bat out. The first gourd he hit exploded in a shower of orange skin and wet innards. He smiled beneath the mask, smashing the other two and moving on to the next. The pumpkins were old by now, starting to rot, and his bat made quick work of them. Jeffrey had finished with the street in no time, his arm burning from the effort, but his desire for more burning hotter still. He had seen people peeking from their windows, but no blue and whites coming to chase him away. The work seemed too easy. The jack-o'-lanterns flew apart with a single swing of the bat, and Jeffrey reveled in the feel of his anger and fear being satiated. He would look back on that feeling throughout his years and feel deep shame, but tonight it was all about his revenge on the source of his terror. Jeffrey was not challenged until 12th Street. He had gotten cocky halfway through his culling. He wasn't content to just smash the pumpkins anymore. Oh no. Jeffrey had started throwing them against trees, mailboxes, and the houses that set silent guardians over them. No one came out to challenge him, their love for their pumpkins going only so far, and Jeffrey felt untouchable as he shattered his latest gourd against the door of 3608 12th Street. When the man lumbered from beside the porch, laying hands on Jeffrey as the boy grabbed front of the pumpkin, Jeffrey was terrified for half a second. The mask had become turned in his effort, and he hadn't seen the man as he started sneaking around. The light was poor, but Jeffrey was pretty sure it was Mr. Basque, his English teacher. He was standing in his bathrobe and asking Jeffrey just what the hell he thought he was doing as he tried to wrestle the last of his pumpkins from him. Jeffrey had a short and squishy tug-of-war with Mr. Basque, and finally had the bright idea to just let the hateful gourd go. Jeffrey's fingers had started to slide through the thin skin at the pumpkin's base anyway, and the last thing he wanted was slime all over his hands. The old man stumbled backwards as Jeffrey released his hold and fell on his backside as the pumpkin splattered against him, covering him in soupy guts and rotten seeds. He looked at Jeffrey for a moment, so lost and afraid of this pumpkin demon who had visited his wrath on his home, and for a moment, Jeffrey came to his senses. He started towards him, wanting to help him up, but then the shadow fell across him, and he looked up to find a true demon standing on the sidewalk. He was standing in the shadow of a giant inflatable pumpkin, and the street light seemed loath to touch him. He was massive, a huge shadowed figure of steel and green. When he sliced the inflatable pumpkin with his axe or sword or whatever he carried, it sputtered in death as it puddled on the lawn. Jeffrey was frozen by him for a moment, his terror and anger at the pumpkins paling compared to his madness at the sight of this creature. Then it spoke, the voice of winter, and he was once again filled with that potent fire. "To hell with him! Your work must be fulfilled!" Jeffrey nodded, mounting his bike and riding off without a second glance at the prone man he'd left behind. By the time Jeffrey finished his work, it was nearly midnight. He had taken so long. How had he taken so long? He had been so taken by the act of destruction that Jeffrey had lost track of time. He was surprised that no one else had come out to challenge him, and wondered how no one had called the police yet. Jeffrey's clothes were splattered with pumpkin, his mask caked with dried seeds and goopy rind, but he didn't feel tired in the least bit. Quite the contrary. Jeffrey felt an almost maniacal need to see more pumpkins squashed beneath his bat. He rode downtown, feeling the cold breeze drive him forward, the chill stroking the blaze of his revenge. The fell breeze felt like oncoming winter, and it seemed to lend Jeffrey its power. As Jeffrey rode into downtown, he passed the remains of many smashed jack-o'-lanterns on the way. Chris and Kevin had been busy, it would seem. Tables had been overturned, and the gaping holes from the pumpkins greeted him as he rode. They had thrown them in the street, smashed windows on the storefronts, and scattered the guts of numerous gourds everywhere. If Jeffrey had been in his right mind, he would have doubtlessly seen this as a little too much. They hadn't agreed to this level of vandalism, nothing even close to this magnitude, but at that moment, Jeffrey was emboldened by the sight of such destruction. This was his will, so Jeffrey thought, and he would reward them for their efforts. Jeffrey felt the mist gathering over the town as much as he saw it. Its icy fingers were making chill bumps pop out on his arms, and he found himself looking for the figure on the sidewalk. Jeffrey expected him to appear out of the mist and cackle, congratulating Jeffrey for orchestrating such a fine bit of mischief, but if he was there, he was staying hidden for now. Jeffrey found Kevin and Chris on the commons. It seemed that this was where the police had been. The cruiser's blue and white lights were cutting through the fog, but they couldn't hold a candle to the blaze that burned on the commons. Jeffrey gawked at it, speechless at the towering bonfire the two had created. They had set the greenhouses on fire. They had set a pyre and called the police right to them. In his wonder and disbelief, though, Jeffrey forgot to keep an eye peeled for trouble. Someone pushed him suddenly, spilling him into the street. They fell on him as he wrenched his arms painfully behind his back, and the fall had knocked the wind out of him. He didn't have the strength to fight them off, and when they lifted Jeffrey to his feet, they shouted for him to stop resisting. Jeffrey was shoved towards a strobing vehicle and pushed into the back seat. He shimmied to the other side, wanting to see if his friends would escape, but what Jeffrey saw was far from what he had expected. Outside, Kevin and Chris were backing into the fog that swirled around the commons. The police were moving in, nightsticks in hand, and the cop that had cuffed Jeffrey was moving up behind them as he yelled into his radio. He didn't seem to be reaching the person that he wanted, though, because Jeffrey saw him jerk his head away as it crackled and sparked in his ear. He cursed and pulled it off, stomping on the box as it caught fire, and looked away from his fellow officers as he tried to put it out. That's why he didn't notice the figure that came riding out of the fog. But Jeffrey saw him. He saw his red eyes first, glowing from high in the fog as he came up behind his friends. He was tall, nearly 10 feet, and Jeffrey saw the two officers freeze as they noticed him. He came between Chris and Kevin, a single hoof stepping from the fog as his horse parted the mist. His armored form came next, his armor forest green, his horned helm the color of moss, his sword shrieking like a wildcat as he drew it out. Kevin and Chris didn't even look at him. Their pumpkin heads were still fixed on the officers. He was far more fantastic than Jeffrey could have imagined. Neither his dream nor the phantom on the sidewalk had done him justice. And when he charged, the officers broke like quail. Jeffrey heard him laugh, that bitter cackle that had haunted his dreams. When he sliced down the first officer, the man tried to impose his flimsy nightstick into the path of that vorpal blade. It sheared through the nightstick, the man's ballistic vest, and finally through his flesh. He fell to the ground in pieces, and the other two cops looked at the twitching pieces a little too long. The figure laid into them with gusto, and Jeffrey jumped as a head bounced off the front glass and rested on the hood. The rider slew them all, rode them down like children, and when he rode towards the cruiser, Jeffrey knew that he had arrived. The Green Man had returned. He leapt the car and rode into town, Chris and Kevin following mutely behind him. Jeffrey pivoted in the seat, screaming for them to help him. He kicked the door, kicked the glass until it splintered into a cascade of spider webs. But the rider and his grotesque minions were already disappearing into the fog. They left him there with the bodies. They left him there to take the blame. Jeffrey kicked until his legs ached. He screamed until his throat felt like it would break. He pulled on the cuffs until his wrists bled. In the end, though, it didn't matter in the slightest. More cops arrived as the mist dissipated. Jeffrey was taken to jail, his mask removed, and his identity discovered. He was thrown in a jail cell, alone, while the cops tried to sort out the havoc that was going on around town. Calls were coming in from all over town. 17 more deaths were reported that night. Fires were blazing in several homes, broken sprinklers and fire hydrants that seemed to have frozen in the balmy October air, and too much vandalism to keep track of. Mark's party had been turned into a bloodbath, and the kids who had escaped were saying that it was a guy with a sword and two guys in pumpkin masks with bats. Through it all, Jeffrey just sat in a dejected state in his cell. They had left him. He had been found unworthy, and now he would rot like one of those pumpkins he had shattered into so much useless paste. At some point, Jeffrey must have dozed off, because when he returned to himself, the sheriff was leaning against the bars of his cell, sipping coffee from a styrofoam cup. "Good. You're awake." Jeffrey said nothing. "Funny how everything seems to go to hell the second I decide to leave town for an evening. My granddaughter wanted me to take her trick-or-treating, so I drove to the next town over to oblige her, and come back to a whole mess of problems. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you, son?" Jeffrey said nothing. "Funny how you decided to smash up all the pumpkins. You know why the early citizens carved those pumpkins, don't you?" Jeffrey continued saying nothing. "Sure you do. There's a mural in the museum. You've probably seen it 1,000 times, but never really thought much about it. The settlers that founded this place came fleeing something they didn't really understand, something they prayed they had left in the old country. That image on the mural of the tide riding down on us, that's not English invaders as we sometimes pretend for the tourists. Granddad said his granddad told him stories of the Green Man, a spirit of winter who sought sacrifice and punished those who would not give him his due." Through it all, Jeffrey said nothing. "That's why we light the jack-o'-lanterns. That's why the tradition is still here today. We light them so we might forget that demon who once haunted us. We light them because they keep him away. You've left us naked in the breeze, boy. You've burned our greenhouses, smashed our talismans, and now there'll be nothing to stop him from coming back tonight." The sheriff stared at him, but Jeffrey said nothing. Did you see him, boy? Did you see that devil? He wrung his hands over the bars like a drowning man treading water, but Jeffrey refused to answer him. After he'd wrung those bars for a few minutes, the sheriff finally left. Jeffrey never saw him again. Jeffrey never saw much of anyone ever again. When he heard the creak and groan of pavement and metal being separated, Jeffrey smiled. He knew they had come for him, and when the bars on the street parted from the cement, he looked up to see Kevin and Chris had returned for him. They were still wearing their masks, but Jeffrey had an idea that those masks weren't rubber anymore. Jeffrey had an idea that those masks were permanent now, and his would be too, once he slipped it on. Jeffrey crawled onto street level, falling to his knees when he saw that he was with them. The voice in his head told him that he needed one more. Those two imps needed a leader. The rider tossed something rubber to the pavement at Jeffrey's feet, and with trembling hands, Jeffrey slid the grotesque pumpkin mask back on. The voice told him he had work to do. The green man called Jeffrey to action, and who was he to deny him? In these hard economic times, it certainly is good of the green man to be out there making jobs, I suppose. Moving along from the spooky to a story that pulls at the heartstrings, let's hear about a holiday tradition that I hope the subject of this story continues. Let's hear about how Grandpa died on Halloween. Grandpa was born on October 30th, 1945. He and my grandma were the closest thing I had to real parents, and I'm grateful to have had them. My dad was never anything more than a name on a birth certificate, and my mom was in an accident just after I was born. I've lived with my grandparents since I was 8 months old, and I learned so much from them. Grandma taught me to take care of myself, to cook and clean, and how to be responsible for a household. From Granddad, I learned, too many things to list. He taught me to hunt, to fish, to manage my money, to pay my debts, how to be a man. As I said, that's a lot to put on a short description, but Grandpa was a great man. He shared everything with me, the two of us being incredibly close, but I recently found out that he held on to one little secret, the secret to his long life, something I learned on the day that he died. Grandpa always celebrated his birthday in the same way. He would sit on the porch with Grandma, both of them in costume, and pass out candy to trick-or-treaters. Grandpa loved Halloween, always wore a costume, and bought the best candy for the scores of kids that came to the farm. Grandpa was known for his corn mazes, spooky decorations, and the best candy in town. I've always helped with the festivities throughout my childhood, and despite all the smiling kids and happy adults, Grandpa always had the biggest grin on his face. As the porch lights started going off, and the kids started heading home, Grandma would light the candles, and we would sing to Grandpa as he sat smiling at the small pile of candles smoldering on top of his cake. In the candlelight, his face always seemed more lined and seamed than it normally did. Granddad had looked 40 well into his 60s, but he looked about 100 in the light of all those candles. After he blew them out, Grandma would cut pieces off the double chocolate cake, and Grandpa would savor every bite like it might be his last. I asked him about it once, and he just laughed and said that one day I'd understand. Then he'd check his watch, 9:55 on the dot, and he'd excuse himself to go set up in his music room. Calling it a music room doesn't really capture its grandeur. Grandpa, back in his day, was a country music star of sorts. He played on the Grand Ole Opry, joined the band with the Presley Jamboree, and he'd opened for Johnny Cash in his heyday. The room was full of pictures of him playing with everyone from Merle Haggard to Conway Twitty, and his guitar collection was awe-inspiring. Granddad spent a lot of time there, as I remember, and he often wrote songs for artists and recording companies. He would sit there on his birthday, however, and play the same old guitar every time. It was a battered old acoustic, the lacquered white body peeling and ratty, the strings worn to the point of unraveling, and the neck seemed chipped beyond repair. Despite this, it was one of Grandpa's favorites, and he picked it often when he was alone. Despite this, he always looked so thoughtful when he played, like it reminded him of something he'd rather forget. Grandpa would sit in there and practice for a little while, and then, at exactly 10:30, he would call me in, kiss my forehead, and tell me to get to bed. I would always stay up on Grandpa's birthday, even if I had school the next day. At 10:30, though, I would go to bed, and I would always listen to the music from the room as Grandpa played. When I was little, I just listened from my bed, the words making me feel weird. Granddad's voice was smooth, ageless, and I sometimes thought that it must be a younger man who was singing with Granddad. In the beginning, I did think I heard a second voice, but I always put it aside as my ears playing tricks on me. Well, what is this I can't see with ice cold hands getting hold of me? Well, I am death, none can excel. Open the door to heaven or hell. I was 6 the first time I snuck out to listen to Granddad. I was so scared, not because I was breaking the rules, but because it was so dark in the hallway. Granddad had one of those old character lamps, Woody Woodpecker, I think, and the bulb was old and yellow. It made a little island of light, a reprieve in the darkness, and I had to walk through the darkness with something like real terror creeping up my throat. I didn't want to go, not at first, but the music seemed to pull me. The closer I got to the door, the closer it all became. I could hear Grandpa's voice oozing from beneath the door, and it enticed me right up to the lock. Oh, death, won't you spare me over to another year? I knew there was definitely a second voice singing, something low and gravelly, and it oddly harmonized with Grandpa's silky tones. That old guitar, the one with the bone-white body, jangled on the 4th key as the tuner loosened in that slow, careful way that it does. Even this didn't sound at odds with the song. It all came together like a dying body singing its final notes. Granddad played, the stranger singing harmony with him, and I leaned against the door as I listened to them. Oh, death, someone would pray, could you wait to call me just another day? The children prayed, the preacher preached, time and mercy are out of your reach. I left before the song was over, climbing into bed and covering up as Granddad finished playing and went to bed himself. I never heard his guest leave, just Grandpa sharing a few quiet words before leaving his music room and heading to bed. Even at 6, I knew that was weird, but I didn't think much of it. I was young, and my brain was involved in other matters, like Ninja Turtles and the 3rd Mario game. I guess that was when I started paying attention to Granddad's yearly ritual. I was young, so it was only precursory at best. I noticed Granddad pass out candy, run the yearly carnival, eat his cake, and then retire to his music room. After I'd gone to bed, he would play that song, his strange guest singing along, and I would sit at the door and listen. It was always the same song, the mournful tone that made my skin prickle. The voice singing with him was part of it, I realized. But I didn't know exactly what I was hearing until much later. I just assumed that he had some friend who came over late to celebrate his birthday, with some songs and maybe a few drinks. I'll fix your feet till you can't walk, lock your jaw so you can't talk, close your eyes so you can't see, this very hour come and go with me. The way the guitar shivered in his hand as his dexterous fingers rang the sounds from the strings was magical. I'd seen his fingers grow thicker and thicker as the arthritis took the mobility from his hands, but it never seemed to extend to his playing. On nights like tonight, though, it was like having my grandfather play in his 20s again. His nimble fingers playing on the aging guitar were ghostly, and I became more scared of the music than anything in the hallway. I have come to take your soul, leave the body and leave it cold, to drop the flesh from off the frame, earth and worms will have their claim. I was 12 when I asked him about the strange jam sessions he had. I was eating eggs and grits at the table, the school bus still an hour away, and the yawn that interrupted my eating made Grandpa chuckle as he entered the kitchen. "Stay up too late reading your funny books again?" Grandpa asked, shaking out his newspaper. He'd been awake since the sun's edges graced the sky, and his hands were already gray with soil. Granddad's father had been a farmer, just like his father before him. Granddad had kept the tradition alive, despite not needing to. Granddad hadn't been foolish with his money like some of his contemporaries had been. He had bought land, invested in things that lasted, and now in his old age, he rested on his laurels. "Nah," I said, deciding to ask the question that had been bugging me for years. "I guess I heard you playing last night and just couldn't get to sleep." Grandpa hummed from behind his paper, but I could tell that the question was something he was considering. It was November 1st, and Grandpa had gone through his usual routine last night, complete with jam session. I had lingered outside the door, my hand on the knob as I listened, and I had only just slipped back in my room when he came out. The whole time he played, I had thought about just throwing the door open and seeing who was singing with him, but the idea seemed tantamount to walking in on Gramps while he was in the shower. Plus, hell, there was something about the person singing with him that scared me a little. I couldn't put my finger on it, but that was not a man to be crept up on. "Who do you play with every year, Gramps?" I asked, keeping eye contact with the back of his paper as he hid behind it. "I never see them leave, but I know I've heard them." Grandpa was quiet for a little while, long enough for me to think that he wouldn't answer. "It's an old friend, kiddo." I took a few more bites as I waited for him to elaborate, but he didn't. Grandma put some breakfast down in front of him, and Grandpa folded his paper and began to eat. I watched the eggs and bacon being forked into his mouth, giving him a moment before plunging onward. Grandpa didn't like being prodded, especially when he was eating, but I needed some answers. "So who are they? I've never seen them come in, or even leave after." "You don't need to know. It's none of your business, kiddo, so don't be nosy." My curiosity was piqued, but Grandpa had made it pretty clear that the subject was closed. It wouldn't do any good to argue once his mind was made up either, but that wouldn't stop me from continuing my investigation. I asked Grandma about it, but she wouldn't tell me much either. "It's something your grandpa's done since he was young. He told me after we were married that it was something he had to do once a year and that I couldn't bother him while he was doing it. The consequences would be dire," is all he would say when I asked him why. When I asked her why he did it at night, she told me that Grandpa had said that he was born at night. He was born at 10:46 on Halloween. He says that has something to do with it, but he's never told me more than that, and I've never asked. Your grandfather is a heck of a man, but business is business. You might not like what you find if you go poking around either, kiddo. I didn't fully understand at 12, but it made me hungry to know more. "Oh, death, whoa, death, won't you spare me over till another year?" I spent the next 10 years crouching outside the door, listening to the song. I'd learned the song. It was an old one, and Grandpa played it better than anyone I'd ever heard. Grandpa played it as though he was busking to buy daily bread. He put his heart and soul into every word, which somehow changed the words. It was something I looked forward to every year, and part of the reason I asked Grandpa to teach me how to play in the first place. "My mother came to my bed, placed a cold towel upon my head. My head is warm, my feet are cold, death's a-moving upon my soul." Grandpa was thrilled when I asked him to teach me. I was 13 and I wanted to know how to make music like him. He told me not to get too ahead of myself, but agreed to teach me after school. He was pretty clear that my schooling had to come first, but he was more than happy to teach me the chords and some techniques. We practiced after school every day, Grandpa taking me through the basics with ease. I took to it pretty quick, Grandpa saying I must have gotten the knack from him, and pretty soon I was playing the usual teenage standbys. Grandpa rolled his eyes as I played Wonderwall and Chop Suey, playing along as I powered through Bridge Over Troubled Waters or House of the Rising Sun. Grandpa taught me some of the old shit-kicking tunes he used to cut his teeth on at the honky-tonks, and soon I was playing along with most of what he threw at me. It wasn't until I picked at the first few chords to the song I'd heard him play on his birthday that he covered my hand and stopped me. "Not that song, kid. Never play that song. That song is... I only play that song once a year, and never until then. Oh, death, how you treating me. Closed my eyes so I can't see. Well, you're hurting my body, you make me cold. You run my life right out of my soul." Grandpa and I played every chance we got, and as the years proceeded, I found I liked playing music with him. I always played for fun, though. I never made it more than something to impress girls at a bonfire, or wow my friends at the talent show. By 16, I knew what I wanted to do with my life. Music was fun, but I loved discovering how things worked. Machines were my passion, but I loved taking anything apart and discovering how it functioned. Granddad supported my plans to go to college after high school, and for graduation, he presented me with a beautiful acoustic guitar. So you don't forget to have fun while you're working your ass off, kiddo. Oh, death, consider my age. Please don't take me at this stage. My wealth is all at your command. If only you'll move your ice-cold hand. Tonight, Grandpa celebrated his 75th birthday in the same way he always did. He dressed as Old MacDonald, Grandma as Mrs. MacDonald, in a long flowery dress, and they handed out candy to cowboys and aliens and various superheroes. I've been living with them while I attend college, and as the kids left and the floodlights went out for the night, I slid the comically large cow head off and joined my grandparents on the porch. Grandma had a double chocolate cake, alight with 75 burning candles. As we ate our cake, I couldn't help but notice that Grandpa looked a little different tonight. Not sad, but speculative, like this might be the last piece of Grandma's cake he ever ate. When I got up to take my plate to the kitchen, Grandpa put a hand on my arm and asked Grandma if she would mind taking my plate too. She said not a bit, and took all 3 plates to the kitchen so she could wash up. Grandpa looked at me, his face asking the question before his mouth, and it was the question I'd been waiting to hear my whole life. "Would you like to come and play with me tonight?" I was speechless. How long had I waited for just that very thing? I nodded at him and followed him to the music room with excitement and apprehension. I was finally going to get to meet Grandpa's mysterious guest, the one I'd heard singing for so many years. I remembered the way that touching the doorknob had made me feel, and wondered if I could even play in his presence. "Oh, the young, the rich, the poor, all alike to me you know. No wealth, no land, silver or gold, nothing satisfies but your soul." He was waiting for us when we came into the studio. He was, well, there was no way to describe him. He was tall, not height-wise, but more long than tall, I guess. His fingers were especially long, and I wondered if he played guitar too. He was dressed in white, his pristine suit complete with a bolo tie, and his hat was a tall 10-gallon that made him look like a rancher on a western. His face gave me the willies, though. He looked like someone had stretched a very believable flesh mask over a cow skull. The bones in his cheeks poked out oddly. His ears were long and curved in strange ways. His eyes were hollow, like a skull, and looking at him made me a little ill. Who was this guy? How did he know my granddad? He must be important if Granddad would spend his birthday evening with him every year.
"Ah, Ramon, good to see you."
"Azzy," Granddad said, taking his guitar off the wall. "Long time no see."
365 days to be exact. So you play for me tonight?
Grandpa looked at the guitar, the bone-white body looking odd against his tan skin, and smiled as he walked towards me. "Nope, my grandson is." He pushed the guitar into my hand and took a seat beside me. The guitar felt strange, like nothing I'd ever held before. The neck felt porous, almost like driftwood, and the body was coarse against my skin. There was a smell to it, something like moldy wood, and I realized I had never actually played this guitar before. Grandpa played it sometimes, but other than the nights like this, he didn't seem to want to touch it. The stranger looked at me expectantly, and as I strummed the chords, I could only think of one song I wanted to play. The song I had heard so many times spilling out from under that door, spilled from my own mouth like he had gutted me. The words bubbled out as I sang for death's reprieve, for death's abatement, and as I sang, I felt the stranger watching me. Though my call was to death, it felt as if this stranger were the one I was truly singing to. I felt like his eyes were boring into me, seeing my worth, and as the song came to a close, he clapped his hands together in mock good cheer. His hands coming together sounded like bones rattling in a crypt.
Well done, kid. You got chops. Maybe not chops as big as your grandpa here, but chops. Take it this means our deal's at an end, Ramon?
Granddad nodded, reaching for the guitar and nodding to me. Head to bed, kid. Azzy and I have some business to discuss. I told him I'd see him tomorrow, but I doubted him when he said he was sure he would. I wept as I lay in bed, not knowing why. Grandma woke me up the next morning. She was crying, her words slurred as she told me that Grandpa was in his music room. He had passed in the chair that he always sat in when he played music. The doctors said it had been a heart attack, that he likely hadn't suffered. I hadn't needed him to tell me that. When I came across Grandpa in his music room, he had the most satisfied smile on his face. That white guitar was laying across his lap, and when I picked it up, I put it away, the touch of it making my skin crawl. I was kind of numb through the funeral, unable to come to terms with what I'd seen. Had that man, the one that Grandpa had called Azzy, been responsible for his death? How had he given Grandpa a heart attack? The more I thought about it, the less sense it made, but I felt like he had something to do with all of this. Grandpa's note, however, brought it all into perspective. Grandpa left me his music room and his will. All the guitars were mine, all the awards, all the music memorabilia, a binder of songs that he hadn't sold yet. It was a generous gift, given on the grounds that I stay in school and help Grandma keep the house up. The house would be mine after Grandma was gone, but I hoped that would be many years away. I found myself there after the funeral, as my eyes strayed to that strange guitar again, and I wondered how I had missed the note. It was slid under the strings on the neck, and the white paper stood out like a surrender flag. I picked it up, trying not to touch the guitar, and unfolded it to see Grandpa's neat handwriting. If you're reading this, kid, then I'm gone. The music room's yours, and I hope you'll take good care of the things in it as I did. I've had a long and happy life, kiddo, and it was made better by watching you grow into a fine man. You'll make a fantastic engineer one day, but for now, I want to talk about the music. I've been playing and singing since I could walk, but it wasn't until Azzy saw me at the Bent Spoon one night that I really got my break. I saw him watching me as I played. How could you miss him, even in a crowd? The longer he watched, the more intent on me he became, and after I was finished, he approached me with an offer. He gave me that guitar, a strange one that I sometimes play, the one that feels like rotten wood, and told me to play. He said as long as I played music with it, I'd be successful, have the kind of money that I could only dream of, and have a long and fruitful life. The trade-off, though, was twofold. Once a year at the time of my birth, I would play that song for him. If I missed a year, then the deal was off, and my life would end. The other part was that, after my death, I would come to his world and play for him for all time. You're a smart kid, like I was a smart kid. You likely realize that Azrael to everyone but me, ain't human. If you take up that guitar and play for him, you can live as I lived. You can be a star. You can live comfortably. But you'll be with him when it's all said and done. I regretted my decisions at leisure, having acted in haste in my youth, but I felt it was time to make good on my deal. I know that when I die, I won't sit at the right hand of God, as it says in those songs I've sung sometimes. I don't know what awaits me, but 75 years is a long time to walk the skin of the earth. I'm tired, kiddo. It seems like a good time to lay my burdens down. I don't know where I'm going, but I hope I don't see you there someday. Tell Melinda I love her, and watch over her until God calls her home. I won't tell you not to take up the guitar, but if you do, I feel like you should know the consequences. I love you, kiddo. Have a great life. Love, Grandpa. That was 5 years ago. Grandma passed away before I graduated college, but I became the engineer that I always wanted to be. I've got a great job. I'm seeing an amazing woman that I mean to propose to next month. And I've made my grandpa's home my own. I still sit in my grandpa's music room sometimes, though, strum a few chords or play something we played together. The white guitar hasn't moved since I put it on the wall the day that Grandpa died, and I don't intend to ever take it down again. Sometimes, though, I get the itch to pick it up and play it, especially on my birthday at around 3 o'clock in the afternoon. I don't think it or its owner will be content with Wonderwall or House of the Rising Sun, though. No, I think it wants something older, something blacker, and I think the bargain will be for something harder to pin down than time or wealth. I may not want to, but I fear that someday I'll take up Grandpa's guitar, and the bargain will be the same as it was for him so many years ago. I fear that one day I'll trade my soul to death so he might spare me over till an... Powerful stuff, as always. But let's go back into something a little more festive. Checking back in with our favorite holiday creep, let's hear a story about the last jack-o'-lantern. George looked down at the smashed gourd and wondered who could have possibly done such a thing. His father had grown pumpkins in this field for generations, and nothing like this had ever happened. The Fontenoys had 500 acres, half of which were just for pumpkins. The east field had been set aside for pumpkin growth, and the jack-o'-lanterns on the fence posts of the field had been smashed to bits. Laying in the road, they appeared to have been left as a warning. It wasn't many, maybe 15 gourds in all, but Daddy looked worried. George tried to mimic the look, and his father must have found it funny on a 10-year-old, because he laughed, dispelling some of the worry that had hung around him like a cloud. "What happened, Daddy?" George asked, smiling a little as the tension wafted away. "Well, kiddo, I think maybe some hellions came and wrecked up our jack-o'-lanterns." "What are hellions?" George asked, getting a little afraid as he thought about monsters or devils coming out after dark. "Oh, just kids out for a good time. Normally I wouldn't be too mad about a little Halloween goofing, but they may not be done, and next time it might be the pumpkins in the field. I can't just stand by and let that pass. Come on, Georgie, we're gonna have to go call the sheriff." They tromped back to the house, putting their work on hold as they went to call Sheriff Langford. Juan passed them as they left the field, and Daddy told him to get some boys together and clean up the pumpkins. Juan said that he would, and called to the others in that rich Spanish that George was starting to pick up. Juan and Maiko were teaching him some of the basics, but when they spoke together, George was lost amidst the words as they came spilling out. Daddy said they spoke like a river, fast and dangerous. George thought they spoke like the people he saw in church sometimes, the ones who had been touched by the Holy Spirit. "Daddy," George asked as they came into the house, "why would someone do that to our pumpkins?" "Well, son," his dad said, fingers turning the dial on the phone he refused to replace, "sometimes people are jealous of what a man has. Sometimes, instead of coveting it, they decide they might want to destroy it. Sometimes it's because they can't make it themselves. Sometimes it's just greed, but they can't really help themselves. In the end, it all amounts to the same thing. A man either has to be broken of it, or he has to die." George heard someone pick up on the other end, and his daddy told the dispatcher he needed the sheriff to the farm right away. George watched as his father laid out the situation for the sheriff. He needed someone to investigate this little issue. He couldn't have this sort of thing happening to his crops. If it was hooligans, then he didn't want to press charges. Boys would be boys, after all, but he wanted this to stop. When Daddy hung up, he seemed in a much better temperament, and George was glad to see him smile again. "Looks like everything's going to be okay, kiddo." George smiled, following his dad out to the field. If his daddy said everything was going to be okay, George saw no reason to doubt him. The next day, though, it was even worse. Juan came to get him and his dad while they ate their breakfast, his face unhappy to have to give such news so early in the morning. "Mr. Fontenay, there has been a problem with the pumpkins again." Daddy had been putting salt on his grits, a fried egg buried somewhere amongst the grain mush, and he looked up unhappily as he told Juan to show him. George left his shredded wheat on the table and went to see what all the fuss was about, shivering as he walked out into the chilly morning air. The sun was just peeking up over the farm, and his arms prickled with goosebumps as the air lay heavy on them. The three walked out amongst the field, the corn parting for them as they headed out to see about the pumpkins. There were broken pumpkins along the fence line, and it appeared that they had come into the field this time. 30 or 40 broken gourds were laying in the field, their skin glistening in the early morning sun. George and his father picked through them, seeing what could be salvaged, but most of it was a wash. They found 4 that weren't too badly damaged, and George asked if he could use them for jack-o'-lanterns. Daddy said that he didn't see any reason why not. Despite being mostly whole, they were still damaged, and he'd never be able to sell them. After his chores, George sat on the porch and carved his pumpkins, as his father called the sheriff and had him out to see what had happened. The sheriff's visit had been different the day before. Daddy had been more amused than angry, but today he seemed really mad about the pumpkins. He and the sheriff had joked about the pumpkins they had smashed and the tricks they had gotten up to in their day yesterday. Daddy had told him again that he didn't want to press any charges, but he definitely wanted this to end. Today, George could hear him shouting at the sheriff that this was getting out of hand and it needed to stop. "We'll put a cruiser across the road tonight and see if we can see 'em. If they come back tonight, we can catch 'em in the act and drag 'em in. Might mean you have to lose a few more pumpkins, but it'll probably mean the end of it for sure. If I keep losing pumpkins, Frank, I'm gonna take this into my own hands. I don't want to shoot somebody's kid, but I will if this keeps up. Don't do anything hasty, Mark. Let the law handle this." "Like you did yesterday?" Daddy said, and the sheriff didn't seem to have an answer for that one. George tried to show his father the pumpkins when he came stomping up the porch, but he didn't seem to notice. As the sun went down, George lit the candles in 3 of his pumpkins, but saved the 4th as he wanted to do something special with it. There was a little ledge on the window of his room, and he toted the small pumpkin upstairs and pushed the door to his room open with his foot. The pumpkin overlooked the farm from its high perch, and as George lit the candle with a long kitchen match, it filled the alcove with a sick kind of yellow light. He heard his father call from downstairs to tell him that dinner was ready, and he blew the candle out as he closed the window. He'd light it again after it got good and dark. That way he could turn the pumpkin to face him and watch its spooky grin flicker. From up here, he could see the fields of pumpkins, including the bare area that Juan and his friends had cleared out. George wondered how many more would be broken tomorrow, and he hoped it would be none. Daddy would be really mad at all the smashed pumpkins. George remembered a time not long ago when his father had been so mad that he'd locked himself in his room for a week. That had been after Mama had gone to be with Jesus, and taken his little sister with her, too. George didn't want to see Daddy like that again. After dinner, George went to his room to play a little, but his daddy went out to the field with his rifle, saying he was going to sit out and keep watch from the porch. George sat awake for a while that night, but as the crickets chirped and the frogs croaked outside, George felt his eyes getting heavier and heavier. The last thing he saw as he drifted off was the pumpkin's glowing face as it winked at him from the small ledge. It had gone out by the time he woke up, but his father's anger had only intensified. He could hear him yelling from the front lawn, and George snuck downstairs, peeking out the front door to see what all the ruckus was about. Daddy was shouting at the sheriff, who was already standing in the doorway with his hands in his pockets. He looked peaceful, but George could tell that he really didn't appreciate getting yelled at so early in the morning. "You say you had your best man on it, but still, I have smashed pumpkins all over my damn field." "I know you're upset, Mark, but you might want to remember who you're talking to. I'm an officer of the law, and I won't sit here and listen to you disrespect me. Then why didn't your man do his job out there? I've got half a field of pumpkins that are nothing more than fertilizer now. If this fellow was at his post like he was supposed to be, he could have stopped that from happening." "I dunno. He should still be out there since he never checked in this morning." The two of them had gone to the sheriff's cruiser, hitting the mic and trying to raise the officer who had come to watch the farm last night. When the sheriff couldn't get an answer, he and George's father had headed into the field, George trailing behind them. He was curious, wanting to see what the two men were talking about. If the officer had fallen asleep, George figured he'd be getting yelled at, and that could be funny to watch. As they crossed the field, now empty of a few more pumpkins, George hung back in the corn. He didn't want to make it obvious that he was following them, but he still wanted to see what would happen. As George peeked through the stalks, he could see the squad car sitting down a small access road across from his father's farm. His dad and the sheriff approached the car, and they must have seen something they didn't like. The sheriff ran up to the car, and when he opened the door, something came tumbling out and splatted onto the ground. His daddy ran over too, and as they lifted the thing up, George could see it was a man in a policeman's uniform. Even with the corn stalks obscuring his vision, it was impossible to miss that the man's head was smashed in. George snuck back to his room as the sheriff used the radio to call for help. George sensed that things had become very bad. That was the first night that George saw the hellions. He was sitting at his window, watching his father as he paced around the yard and kept watch. It was late, the moon hanging high overhead, but George just couldn't get to sleep. He had sat on the front porch most of the day, his deer rifle across his lap. Things had changed after the sheriff found the body, and now the farm felt like a prison. Juan and the hands went about the usual chores, rotating the crops that needed to be taken in and clearing away the mess from the night before. The hooligans had flattened about 30 to 40 pumpkins, and now there wasn't a pumpkin anywhere near the road. The area around the fence was cleared away, and appeared to be getting closer to the house with each passing night. Daddy had set up that whole night, watching the field with his rifle, as 2 squad cars circled the farm every half hour. When the sun came up, the pumpkins had still been smashed. The cops could talk about the thick fog that had rolled in the early morning, but that hadn't stopped Daddy from being completely furious with everyone. George had woken up to the sound of his dad telling the sheriff that he didn't need the police. He told them not to bother coming back that night, that he and his men could handle this, and that he didn't need such ineffective help. The sheriff had been calm throughout the whole endeavor, and finally told his daddy not to do anything foolish. If you shoot some kids for smashing up your pumpkins, I can't arrest you, but the town might have other ideas. I'd hate to see a lynch mob raised because of a little Helen. As the cruiser rolled off, Daddy yelled for Juan and the others to get to work before heading off to bed. He hadn't told George to keep watch, but he hadn't had to. This was George's farm, his birthright one day, and it was as much his to protect as it was his dad's. When his father came onto the porch at sunset, seeing his son out there with his deer rifle, his eyes heavy, he had ruffled his hair and told him to go on ahead to bed, that he'd take watch now. As George went inside, he knew he should be exhausted, but as he watched his father pace around, he found that he couldn't be less tired. As he sat and watched, he saw something roll in slowly. A thick fog came creeping over the crops. It wasn't a normal fog, not the wispy stuff they got this time of year. It was thick and deep, a winter fog, and as it crawled across the field, George saw shapes stumbling through it. As it came close to the house, George could see it part as if it refused to come any closer to the porch. Daddy stood amongst it, barely visible, but George wasn't looking at him. He was watching the figures who came creeping towards the house. They were man-shaped, but their heads were lumpy and deformed. They moved seamlessly through the fog, cutting through it like a shark through water. They approached the porch, clearly looking for George's father, and as he took notice of them, he cut loose with his shotgun. George jumped as the blasts parted the fog, but if the bullets bothered them, they didn't show it. His daddy backed up, firing again before reaching for more shells, and as they came closer, George could see why their heads looked so strange. They were topped with pumpkins. Each of their heads was a sneering jack-o'-lantern. Their eyes seemed to blaze with hateful fires, and George thought he could hear them chuckling to themselves as they approached. They carried farm implements in their hands, scythes and hatchets and hoes, and the longer he watched them, the more of them George saw. At first, it had seemed like only 3, but as they continued to spill out of the fog, George counted as many as a dozen. They came closer and closer, and Daddy blasted them from the porch as they backed him towards the door. His bullets had little effect on them, but George noticed them stop when they saw the jack-o'-lanterns he'd put on the porch rails. The group paused, halted by their smiling, glowing counterparts, and as they turned to leave, George could only shake his head and wonder why. When the door banged open, George flung himself into bed when he heard Daddy come thundering up the stairs, worried that he might get in trouble. As the adrenaline left him, he felt his eyes getting heavy as he focused on the flickering protector outside his window, the candle burning low as he went to sleep. George and his father were coming off the porch when his daddy saw Juan in his hands taking more pumpkins into barrows from the east field. Even from here, George could tell that they looked too hurried in their work, and his father sped up as he came towards the men. Some of them put their heads down and hurried along, but Juan stood his ground and waited to receive the reprimand he knew was coming. "Mr. Fontener, we were just cleaning up some of the pumpkins there before I noticed," his father asked, barely keeping the anger out of his voice. Juan nodded, not looking away. "Yes, sir." "How many?" George's father asked, winter ice in his voice. "There are about 70 pumpkins left. The ones we found this morning look like they were frozen in the field before they broke them. I don't understand how they did that, but they've been ruined nonetheless." Daddy nodded, but his glowering never changed. "I want you and your boys to come by tonight. We'll take all the pumpkins left and put them in the barn. Tonight, we're gonna catch whoever's been doing this. Tell your friends to bring whatever they have for protection, and get ready to stay up tonight. I'll pay all of you double, but I need every hand available." Juan thought about it, finally nodding as he told Daddy that he could count on him. George followed him back inside, watching as he called the sheriff next and told him about what had happened. "I don't think this is just hellions out for Halloween pranks. Something weird is going on, and if you want to help, be here tonight after sunset. I'm gonna set a trap for them, and if we have enough hands, maybe we can settle this without violence." He nodded and mm-hummed into the phone, and when he hung up, George smiled and said he could count on him too, but his father shook his head. "No, I want you inside while this is going on. If anything happens, I want you to call the police and let them know to send more help. I know it's likely to be scary here all by yourself, but I want you to be brave, okay?" "Sure thing, Daddy. I'll be here if you need me." His dad had ruffled his hair then, smiling at his son with real pride. "I know you will, kiddo. I have faith in you, and I hope that after tonight, we can get back to farming and leave all this nonsense behind us." George hoped so too, but as they went about making plans and getting ready for the night to come, the hellions he had seen last night were never far from his mind. George stood at the window once again, watching the barn as it flickered with light. The sheriff had shown up around sunset with 3 other officers from the county station, and the 4 of them had gone off to join the dozen or so armed farmhands. Daddy had lit the pumpkins on the porch, their light glittering as the sun set over the fields. George could see them getting ready as he lit his own pumpkin, and the candle danced happily as the jack-o'-lantern smiled over the field. As night spread itself across the farm, George yawned and leaned against the windowsill. It had been a long day, and his eyes were getting heavy. He needed to stay up. He had to make sure that if Daddy needed his help, he could be there to call in that help. The moon rose to replace the sun, hanging full and ghostly over the remaining crop. George thought the east field looked weird without any pumpkins to add color to the dirt. Daddy and Juan and the other men had stacked them all up in the barn, and now they were just waiting to see if the men in the pumpkin masks would come back again. He had asked his dad if the men in the masks were the hellions he'd been talking about, but his father hadn't answered. He had looked strange when George had said the word masks, like he couldn't quite believe what he'd heard. George hoped that that was the case. The alternative seemed to be that Daddy didn't think they were masks at all, which was far more scary. As George watched the barn, he yawned again, leaning on his hands as he tried to stay awake. He sat up a few seconds later, deciding that was much too comfy. He rubbed his eyes and stood up, trying to focus on the blurry barn that hunkered outside the croplands like a hunting cat. He could see his daddy out front, the shotgun held in his hand, and the sheriff in his furry coat standing next to him. George felt better with the sheriff there. He knew that his father didn't think much of him after the mess with the deputy, but George had always liked him. He was friendly, not prone to speaking harshly to the kids in town like some of the other men he hired, and he was always trying to help people. George snorted awake, that last blink having lasted a few seconds longer than he'd meant it to, and got up to walk around. He would not fall asleep. He would stay awake and keep watch. His daddy needed him to stay awake. If he needed help, he needed to be able to get it for him. He sat back on the window seat and rubbed his eyes angrily. He would stay awake. He would stay awake. He shook himself awake, realizing he'd fallen asleep. The scene outside his window had changed, and not for the better. The deep fog that had been there the night before had rolled in again, and George couldn't see anything beyond the front porch. The barn was a shadowy, flickering thing, sitting ghostly behind the fog. George could see shapes moving in that fog. There were flashes out there, the sounds of gunshots muffled as they came to him, and George realized that the Hellions were back. The lumpy heads of their attackers could barely be seen through the fog, but George saw many, many more than he'd seen the night before. There was something else out there too, something big. Its antlers poked up through the fog, and it moved much faster than any of the pumpkin men. It was cutting a sharp path for the barn, and George backed away from the window as a shudder ran through him. It had felt like the thing had seen him, though he didn't know how it could have. He didn't know how they were doing out there, but he remembered what his daddy had said. He needed to call for help. He flipped the light switch in the hallway, but it stayed dark. The thought of running past the open doors to dark rooms where a hand could be waiting to grab him, made his legs shake, and he went back to look for a flashlight. The flashlight wouldn't make the hands go away, but it would make him brave enough to do what he needed to do. The light on the nightstand was dead. The camp lantern in the closet was dry and would need more kerosene, and the matches he had would go out if he ran. He looked to the window, and that was when the answer came to him. He opened the window and took the pumpkin inside, the candle burning low, but still burning. He hugged it close as he ran down the hallway, holding the bottom so the candle wouldn't fall out. It threatened to gutter a few times, but as George came thumping down the stairs, he saw that it was still lit and breathed a sigh of relief. The living room was dark, but the moon coming in from outside provided a little bit of light. George went to the landline in the living room and dialed the familiar number that every child is taught in an emergency. He balanced the pumpkin in his arms as he put the phone to his ear, but the sound he heard made his blood run cold. The line was dead. Whatever was happening, they had cut the power. George looked at the front door, and suddenly he wanted nothing so much as to be with his father. His father would protect him. Daddy would make all the monsters go away. George was still young enough to believe in the talismanic power of his parents, and he needed to touch him and hug him close so that all the bad things would just be a bad dream the next morning. He came out onto the front porch before he could think better of it, and the door flapping shut behind him sounded as good as a dinner bell to any boogans nearby. The steps creaked ominously as George came down them with his jack-o'-lantern light. The fog was thick around him as he moved amongst the corn, and the barn was a bright torch off to his left. It felt too bright, like a beacon rather than the comforting light of lamps, and the closer he got, the more he could feel the heat as it baked away the fog. The barn was burning. George knew that somehow, but he still needed to get to his daddy. His father would make it all go away, just like when Mama died. He would make it all okay, and when he woke up in the morning, all this would just be a bad dream he'd had. He came out of the fog and saw the barn as it spewed ash into the sky. Whatever had been in there was gone now, and George prayed that his daddy was somewhere else. He came around the edge of the barn, towards the front, and the pumpkin was becoming heavy in his hands. Why was he still carrying it? He should have dropped it by now, but it seemed fitting that he keep it. The warmth was nice as the small candle burned its life away, and when he rounded the front, he saw the door sagging as it bulged against the inferno it barely contained. His father lay before the door. He was in two pieces. Something had cut him at the waist, and his daddy had fallen onto the dust of the barnyard. His gun was still in his hand, a scattering of shells around him where they had spilled from his hand, and George crouched beside him, feeling his tears rolling silently down his face. He was dead, his eyes wide and staring, and the look on his face was shocked, disbelieving, terrified. The snort of a horse brought him around, and George cradled the pumpkin as he stood to see what was coming for him. The rider broke the fog, his green armor glistening with the water from that hellish mist. His rack of antlers was magnificent as it sprouted from his sea-green helmet, but his eyes, the eyes of the rider, burned like the coals in a winter fire. He saw George, his horse pawing at the ground as if it longed to charge him, but the knight stayed still as he and the boy locked eyes. As he stood, taking deep breaths, George felt cold in a way he had never felt before. He would have said such a thing was impossible, not with the barn burning so close behind him, but his arms and legs felt numb, and his teeth began to chatter as he locked eyes with the green warrior. He heard the plop before he was aware that he had dropped it, and when he glanced down, he saw the remains of the shattered jack-o'-lantern at his feet. "A shame," whispered a voice. It sounded like a corpse, whispering as it was forced from a frozen grave, and when George looked up, he saw the blade coming in fast and strong. He thought, this must be what the wheat sees before it is cut. It was his last thought before his head fell to join the ruined pumpkin.
One more story for you, and I promised I've saved a good one for last. Sometimes the best holiday stories, Halloween especially, are the ones we bring from the old country. So, let's hear a story about a spooky creature that predates America by quite a bit. Let's hear a tale about Stingy Jack.
Doubtless, our stories were what brought him in. This was the first Halloween after our town lifted the COVID restrictions, and most of us were taking advantage of it. My friends and I were probably a little too old to trick-or-treat, but it really didn't matter to us. We made some last-minute costumes and went out to join the kids, though I don't think any of them were fooled. We were 13, nearly ready for high school, but they filled our pillowcases nonetheless. Rich was some kind of cowboy, Hank a car crash victim with some red paint and a little makeup, and I had thrown on a long coat from my older sister's costume trunk and some fake vampire teeth to make me look particularly ghoulish. The three of us had hit the streets after that. The candy was secondary anyway, and we all knew it. Halloween fell on a Friday this year, you see. That meant that we could go eat our candy at the fire pit once we were done, and our parents probably wouldn't expect us home till late. The fire pit was a common spot for us to go to when the weather was good. We would light a fire and tell ghost stories around it, usually roasting marshmallows or hot dogs to go along with the tales. It was something we looked forward to, and it wasn't something we'd got to do in a while. So, with our parents' blessing, we put our pillowcases over our shoulders and stalked off into the woods that surrounded the cul-de-sac where we all lived. The rain had been light that year, and after collecting up some branches and getting a fire going, we set about starting our stories as the round Halloween moon hung overhead. Rich had just begun a story about a group of kids camping in the woods on Halloween when he suddenly stopped and squinted into the trees. "What?" asked Hank, clearly smelling mischief as he tossed the stick off of his blow-pop into the fire. "Could have sworn I saw something," Rich said, "like fairy fire or something." I turned to look, thinking he was building tension for his story, when I saw it too. It was like dancing candles, the shapes bouncing and jouncing in the dark. and the closer it came, the easier it was to recognize. It was too cohesive to be fireflies, and too consistent to be anything but what it was. The closer it came, the more I could make out the familiar shape of a jack-o'-lantern, though the realization did little to put me at ease. Unless it was being carried by a ghost, then someone had to be holding it, and the idea of some random person wandering in the woods at night was a little off-putting all on its own. The owner of the pumpkin turned out to be an old tramp who smelled as if he'd been bathed in cheap liquor. He came swaying out of the woods, singing a slurry song as he came, and we all hunched a little as we hoped he would pass us by. The call of the fire turned out to be a little too much for him, though, and I caught the last refrains of his song as he crunched into the clearing. Well, stingy Jack was turned away, for nary heaven or hell did want him, but Satan lit a friendly face, so a smile would go afore him. He sang out the last line as he came to the fire, plopping down on a log as if it had been left there for him. He was dressed in shabby cast-off clothes, the pants cuffs full of cockleburrs and the shirt covered in stains. His burnt orange hair had grown into his beard, and it was hard to see much of his face through the tangle. He set the jack-o'-lantern on his lap, the gourd having a handle through it, and nodded at the three of us as we stared mistrustfully at him. A fine evening to y'all. Dunna mean to startle ya. I'd thought for sure your fire might be unoccupied. But I see I was mistaken. You wouldn't mind sharing a tale or two with old Jackie now, would ya? His accent was very thick, thicker than I'd ever heard in my whole life, and the three of us just stared at each other before shrugging. There didn't seem to be any harm in the old fella, and maybe he had a tale or two to tell us as well. It was kind of novel to have someone else who might tell a story, and we told him he was welcome to listen, if he wanted. I think, even then, I might have started to put two and two together, but it was just an inkling at first, something about the song and the pumpkin he carried. Rich continued his story about the three kids camping on Halloween, and how the mysterious whistler who tormented them had finally driven them crazy. Rich even whistled a little in a few parts, and we were all pretty spooked by the end. I cast a glance at our stowaway, but he just sat placidly on his stump, with his beetle-black eyes twinkling in the tangle of his beard, and his pumpkin winking in the slight breeze. A fine story, he said, looking across the fire at the rest of us. Anyone else got a good tale? Nothing I like more on Halloween than a good yarn. Hank tossed a Jolly Rancher into his mouth, and around the slight lisp of the dissolving candy against his cheek, he told a story about a kid who hated jack-o'-lanterns. As Hank's story went on, I found my eyes glued to the old fella as his smiling eyes took a distinctly downward cast. He clutched his pumpkin tightly as Hank talked about how the boys had smashed them, all in the service of the Green Man, and he didn't seem to care for that much. I suddenly wondered how long he'd been toting that pumpkin, and whether it was an actual gourd or some kind of prop. His bearded face twitched when Hank mentioned the Green Man, and began to wonder if it was a legend he was aware of. Rich did a little golf clap as Hank finished, and the old vag was still clutching at his pumpkin like he might try to steal it. This Green Man, have you ever seen him round these parts? Hank laughed. Of course not, sir. It's just a story. Nobody really believes in the Green Man. It's just a legend we tell to scare each other. The old man nodded at Hank, but to me it looked condescending. It was the same look that little kids give you when you try to tell them there was no Santa Claus. It's a look that says, sure, that's what you say, but we all know better, don't we? He loosened his grip on his gourd, turning to me as if asking if I had a story for him too. I guess I do, I said, though it's not a very scary story." "Psh," Rich said. "Then what kind of story is it? We all told spooky ones. This one better be something awesome if it isn't scary." The old man was looking at me with interest, as if he knew exactly what I might tell, and I was excited to hear it. It's an old story my gran told me when I was little. She used to tell it to me while we were carving pumpkins, and it's supposed to be from the old times. It's about a man named Stingy Jack, and how he's the reason for jack-o'-lanterns. Rich rolled his eyes, but one look at the old fella showed me that I had his undivided attention. It's also about how he tricked the devil not once, but twice. That had his attention, and Rich leaned back as he looked over, nodding for me to continue. The old man was nodding too, and I smiled as I started my story. Stingy Jack was supposed to be one of the most skinflint drunks in the village he lived in. He never bought new clothes, he didn't take care of his property, and he was a sot drunk every day, including Sunday. He was not held in high regard by the townspeople, but as little as they liked him, none could argue that Jack was clever. He never wanted for whiskey or money, and his deals and bets often set him against the townspeople. It was widely believed that one day he would come to a sticky end, and one day his reputation caught up with him. You see, the devil had heard about his cleverness and how his trickery might rival even his own. So he came to Earth to try and weasel the old drunk out of his soul so he could claim his cleverness for his own. Jack was sleeping beneath an old tree when the devil appeared before him, and even half asleep, he was formidable. He begged the devil to grant him one last request before he took him to the underworld, and when the old imp asked him what it was, he said he wanted one last drink at the local tavern. My friends were listening, but it was more out of polite interest. The story had no monsters or murderers or any of the usual scary story fare, and they were getting a little bored with my grandma's Irish folk tales. They, however, were not the one I'd been targeting with my story. The old man was leaning forward on his log and was close enough that I was worried he might catch his beard on fire. Well, one drink became two became too many, and soon the devil was well and truly drunk. So when Jack passed him the bill, the devil was confused. "What use do denizens of hell have for money?" he asked, the barman standing back in fear as the old demon raged. Jack, however, had an answer. "Why not turn yourself into a gold piece? Then we can be paying this old fool, and you can be taking me onto the fiery underworld." So the devil did just that. He turned himself into a fat gold piece, but before the barman could scoop it up, Jack had popped it into his own pocket, right next to his mother's rosary. The devil writhed and begged, wanting to be free of this prison, but Jack told him that he wouldn't let him go unless he promised to spare his soul for another 10 years. The devil accepted this deal, and Jack took the coin and tossed it as far from him as he could. The devil had been bested, but he didn't fret. What was 10 years to him after all? He could wait on Jack's soul a little longer, and he returned to hell to wait for the deal to be over. I didn't bother to look at my friends, but I had eyes only for the strange man. He was the best audience I'd ever had, looking intently at me as Gran's tale unwound like old soft yarn. So, 10 years went by, and the devil returned to once again collect Jack's soul. He found him sleeping beneath the same tree, having aged not a day from the last time he'd seen him. He told Jack that today he would repay his debt, but 10 years had done nothing to dull Jack's cleverness. He begged the devil once again for a single boon before he took him to hell, an apple from the tastiest tree for his final meal. Well, Satan was hesitant to say the least, but he would find no trap there. So he climbed the tree to get the apple. It was late season, however, and the only remaining apple was at the very top. As he climbed up the thick old branches, this gave Jack plenty of time to carve a cross at the bottom of the tree, trapping him in the boughs. The devil cursed and railed at the man, begged and pleaded, and finally offered him riches beyond measure. Jack, however, only wanted one thing. I paused, letting the suspense draw out a little, though I suspected it was just the haggard old man. He wanted to never again be bothered by the fallen angel or any of his ilk, and to never be in danger of his soul going to hell again. The devil again railed and threatened, begged and pleaded, but in the end, he surrendered and gave the old man what he wanted. He went back to hell the loser in yet another exchange, but Jack's victory and his luck was not to last. The old man sat back a little, clearly not looking forward to the rest of the story. He liked tales of cleverness all well and good, but it appeared this part might be a sore subject for him. I suspected even more now that I knew what had brought him to our fire, and it was something else that Gran had told me on the porch when I was just a tyke. He was not a young man, and when he died of natural causes not long after, there was the question of where he would go. He could not go to heaven, for he had not lived a godly life, but he could not go to hell either because of the deal he had made. So Jack was forced to walk the earth, but the devil gave him something to remember him by. He gifted him a coal of hellfire and a gourd to carry it in. So stingy Jack walks the earth for all time with that gourd to light his way, and the face it carries has become the pumpkin that we all carve to ward away the devil should he come to our home some Halloween night. There was silence after the story ended, and the wind rustled the leaves as we all sat watching the homeless man. He sat like a statue, grinning behind his beard as the pumpkin flickered ghoulishly. Were the flames a little bit green? They might have been, but I couldn't be sure. The leaves made a skeletal sound in the wind, and as the knot popped in the fire, it brought us all back to our senses. "Not a real scary story," Rich said, "but it was interesting. How about you, sir? You got any stories you'd—" But he stopped as he looked dumbfounded at the place where the old man had been not a moment before. The log was empty, save for a pumpkin sitting on it. I kept that pumpkin, taking it home and keeping it well past the Halloween season. It burns in my windowsill now, the ghostly glow casting long shadows up my wall. I don't know why I told that story. It was one I hadn't thought of in years, but it seemed fitting. Somehow, and I don't know how, I think I knew who it was that sat by my fire that night and decided to remind him that there are people who remembered him. My gran certainly did, often telling the story when I was young, and Stingy Jack was one of her favorite stories to tell us as we gathered around the fire for a tale. She always told us that if we should see him around our fires, that it was best to flatter creatures of the hereafter so they didn't haunt us for too long. Watching the ghostly flames dance on the wall as I write this, I guess he was pleased.
And just like that, our stories are at an end once again. I do hope you've enjoyed today's Cozy Horror, and I hope we'll see you back very soon for more. Until then, this is Dr. Plague, wishing you a wonderful day and a spooky evening.